And when they say, "What can I do alone?" Remember, even one person in the field is a warrior if he is a person with a capital letter possessing knowledge. One can do a lot, not just in the life of a city, in the life of a country, in the life of humanity, if it will send certain informational influences on the hearts and minds of people. That is, one should not be afraid to take on this mission and share this knowledge with people. The measure of uncertainty. What is the next concept? Probabilistic predestination of a certain particularity is always a fragment of the universal measure. Here it is, you see, so to speak, this matrix, the funnel that we have drawn together multiple times. It is right here. Therefore, the probabilistic predestination of a certain particularity is always a fragment of this universal measure. That is, the statistical predestination of the existence of all particularities in the fullness of the entire universe. Probability theory is the theory of measures of uncertainty, generally speaking, implemented. And thus, the unique definite variant from a certain set of variants. And here in the picture it is drawn, look, what is drawn are the processes. This green process is ours. And it transitions from one state to another. That is, we are in this state. We have options 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Well, we chose this path and went down this path. And we are doing well on this path. But we must take into account that various different processes are indeed flowing nearby. They are right next to us. And they have their impact. That is, interference on our process. That is, this red process has its impact on this process, and this blue process also interferes with our process. So, you see, therefore, in order to act correctly, one must understand that these processes influence your process, generally speaking. Therefore, when we talked, remember, if you take your, I am interested in the national question, right? But is it something that exists on its own? That is, it is influenced by this and this and this. And the person who says, I don't want to consider this, it doesn't happen like that. This is not interesting to me, and I just don't want to know this. It doesn't happen like that. But these processes do exist, and they have an impact on your process. Therefore, scientists, and especially managers who oversee these things, must simply take this into account in their activities. Therefore, based on this, if you are solving the task of creating a paper production plant, you must consider that the availability of raw materials, the credit and financial system, and money will influence this plant, and the credit and financial system is global, depending on who determines the parity of currencies. And many of our entrepreneurs say you have to keep spinning. You understand, what does that specific guy need? And they don't understand, where did Kirienko's default come from? Did he create it? So, is the crisis global? The credit and financial system, bank crash, and 300,000 in Moscow after Kirienko's default. The cool ones went into a deep binge, sold their mobile phones, pagers, their firms collapsed. Were they fools? No. For them it doesn't exist. Global politics, what does that have to do with it? What global politics? Stop this nonsense. There is no world government. History goes on by itself, like the mortar with Baba Yaga. That is, everything happens on its own. If something happens, it means someone needed it. There are no coincidences. Therefore, the conclusion from this, what I have told, is that you should always be guided by the fact that alongside your processes, other processes are occurring, and you need to understand their influence on your process. That's all. And many of our scientists, so to speak, do not consider such an approach in its entirety. Why? They suffer from kaleidoscopic idiocy. Remember the pyramids. I know my own, only my own. Physicists, physics, lyricists, lyrics. And what is the influence there? Religions control millions of people. It doesn't exist. Religions are on their own. The government is on its own. But the fact that the church controls the minds of millions of people and determines their behavior is not considered. And another religion determines different behavior in people. And politicians say, so religion is not our business. And other fools say, I'm out of politics. Do you understand? So here you have an example of kaleidoscopic idiocy. And the approach must indeed be understood that each individual measure interacts with many other measures, and this is determined in their entirety. So, what else does this mean from what has been said? It means that the lower the probability of implementing any option, the higher the quality of management should be in this picture. So, here again is the letter G. Here is the law of normal distribution. The probability of this event occurring, that tomorrow will be the same as yesterday, is high, while the probability of this event occurring is very small. Do you see? Therefore, in order for the process to move in this direction, what is needed? High quality of management. And there must be a high qualification of the manager, who acts according to the full function of management, options for the future. If the probabilistic determinism of the future is equal to 1, you see here, then the content of this future is not defined. Yes, the future will be, but what will that future be like? Here you see scales drawn. On the scales, the future is generally represented by this boulder. And on the other side of the scales, there are many different small stones, which by their weight determine what this future consists of. And each small stone has its own probability, its own weight. Therefore, each option corresponds to its own value from 0 to 1. That is the probability of the future occurring. And all these options can be mutually exclusive, complementary, fragments of other options, and so on. That is, their mutual influence can be very diverse. The universe is hierarchical, as you can see, meaning there is a hierarchy. We have already considered it together. That is, a person, here he is in this hierarchy, depends on the state of society, the state of the planet's biosphere, and so on, all the way up to God. This hierarchy exists. Therefore, based on this, the probabilistic certainty of the future is equal to 1, but the distribution and ratio of these options and the relationship to the hierarchical nature of state vectors in each of these options according to the subject's perception of the hierarchy of the universe as objective reality. This distribution among options changes as the situation develops. Therefore, one must approach all situations in life creatively, based on the understanding that everything flows, everything changes, and one must track changes in events in life in order to understand that this change also affects your process that you want to manage here in this picture. The errors in assessing probabilistic predeterminations are illustrated. They can arise for the subject in connection with what, as a result of inadequate perception and understanding by the subject of these available options. There can also be distinctions between the options themselves and the sequence in which they follow one another as they gradually develop. That is, generally speaking, what is depicted here. A person must reach somewhere, and he can, for his choose a car, plane, boat, so on, for transportation. And depending on this, he can first use a car, then a plane, and then, so to speak, a boat to sail. If he chooses these options incorrectly, let's say, he needs to sail across the sea, but he chose a car, then he won't get anywhere. That is, errors in assessing probabilistic predeterminations can be caused by the subject themselves due to the incorrect correlation of choices and the order of these options. We are human beings, right? And we can make mistakes in general. No one, as they say, is immune to mistakes. Due to the limitations of perception, he does not perceive the exact value of probabilistic predetermination as equal to 1. He perceives it as a certain number. That is, the probability, as it is depicted here, is less than 1, and this probability he identifies with some exact value and forgets that it is merely an approximate value, and it contains some error, and the degree of this error varies, and it lies in the future. In determining whether you defined it correctly, and in defining each specific variant of that future. Therefore, these errors can exist, But the most important thing to understand is that the overall probabilistic predetermination of this entire multitude of options is less than 1 and is always a subjective assessment. This error also lies within the range from 1 regarding the occurrence of some event in the present from 0 to 1. Then this error plus the probability of the event occurring will equal 1. And these uncertainties in the process of managing probabilities correspond to management error, or the error of management, or what is indeed called a miracle. And depending on this, it particularly depends on each subject who in particular determines this error. Thus, the degree of error in choosing probabilistic predeterminations is determined by the subject, depending on the subject, and this error is present, but it can also be that miracle, which is not perceived at the current historical moment, but in reality, it is what can be achieved as ideal management. In fact, what does the feeling of peace really give? The perception of multiple future options and the probabilistic predeterminations of each option. A person can be mistaken both in perceiving the descriptions of options, that is, possible states, and in perceiving the probabilistic predeterminations of each option. And so regarding social processes, Kluchevsky said that the regularity of a historical phenomenon is inversely proportional to its spirituality, that is, morality. And we have already studied that in a totalitarian society, the spirituality of the majority of people is equal to 0. Therefore, the entire history of a totalitarian society is like a broken record, repeating itself like 2 times 2 equals 4. And therefore, breaking out of this wheel means that tomorrow usually turns out to be just like yesterday. And tomorrow will also be just like today. That is, everything in this totalitarian society is based on a concept devoid of spirituality. Therefore, the perception of options with very low probability, look here, the letter G is drawn again, and here is a small point. This point is equivalent to a very small possible variant of changing the overall course of events, which corresponds to high spirituality. Therefore, the Talmud serves to exclude the realization of these unlikely options from the life of a likely totalitarian society, and the Talmud states that the best of the outcasts deserves death. Therefore, when people emerge who seek to change the lives of others and alter the management concept according to the totalitarian model, this Talmudism provides for the destruction of all spiritual questions and the realization of this unlikely variant of the future. It is destroyed and probabilistically predetermined. Therefore, to escape this, one must present their own management concept and not be subservient to the principles that exist in a totalitarian society. Now we will examine how prophets work. What is prophecy, forecasting, programming, and how does prophecy differ from forecasting, and so on? So let's talk about prophecies. Formalization of this process. It is depicted on this poster. Look here. There is a singular phenomenon. That is, some process is occurring. It is conditioned by certain causes and takes place under certain conditions. Naturally, this process is followed by certain consequences. This process exists. This is one phenomenon. Now, a mass phenomenon. One process is happening. Another process, a third, and so on. A multitude of processes. Here again, each process has its own causes, conditions of flow, and you see the consequences of each process, which are the result of that process. And here everything is explained as identical causes under identical conditions lead processes to identical consequences. Obviously, we have examined this matter together. All of this, generally speaking, can be defined by statistics. That is, there is statistics on the flow of various processes. There, one can track the causes that gave rise to these processes, the conditions in which these processes occurred, One can gather statistics on the consequences of these processes and so on. That is, there is statistical material. Thus, in essence, the uniformity of these consequences essentially defines statistical predetermination. And now look, if a person can observe what is happening and analyze all of this from a higher level of management, that is, all these processes are before them. He has risen and looks from the perspective of the overall course of events, how they unfold. That is, the ability to mentally elevate one's perception of what is happening to a higher level of understanding. Further, knowledge of the statistics of the past, how it happened, these phenomena in the past. And most importantly, a sense of the universal world in relation to the unknown. The analysis of this statistical material, knowledge of statistical predeterminations. Then one can predict the future with varying degrees of probability, of course, depending on how accurately you assess these events. And the most important thing is to eliminate the undesirable from the future at will. That's all. Generally speaking, there's nothing tricky here. Let's move on. The initial data for all this we just reviewed together. What did we review? So, here is J. Life is the practice of unambiguous realization of multiple probabilities and predeterminations. Remember, this is the letter J. There are many possible options, but one must be realized. And life is the practice of realizing various options that open up before you in life situations. Mathematical probability theory is an idealized model. It excludes subjectivism. The management of many processes is influenced and determined under the influence of a specific personality that acts in accordance with the complete management function in various contexts and situations. Therefore, the management process is real in life. It is not a probability theory. It is carried out by a specific personality that acts according to the complete management function. Therefore, we have already learned that probability theory and statistics are blind to the personal aspect of management. This means that one must always consider the personality. And here this formula is repeated. The probabilistic predetermination of the occurrence of any event is the mathematical probability of the self-fulfillment of that event, multiplied by the personality of the manager as the bearer of certain capabilities. In essence, the mathematical probability of the self-fulfillment of an event is faceless, and probabilistic predetermination has a personal aspect. And if statistical patterns are unchanging and known, then these statistical patterns can be used for forecasting, such as describing possible future scenarios. All of this can be done, meaning that based on probability theory, using the complete management function, with an understanding of management processes. And all the processes carried out by a specific individual, one can speak of the realization of each possible option in a comprehensive manner and thoroughly, in detail and meticulously, with precision and accuracy in every aspect and dimension and every possible scenario. Here we are, actually repeating what we have already covered. And next we will talk about divine providence. What is divine providence and how should we relate to it? What is depicted in this picture? Here stands a person, and he is limited by a certain threshold of sensitivity. Here, a fence is drawn in red. That is, we are such people that not everything is within our power. We are not equal to the gods, but only similar to God. Therefore, beyond this threshold of sensitivity, which is characteristic of humans, something may happen. Something is happening that a person does not understand. And this something that is happening lies outside of human perception. This is what is called divine providence, or hierarchically higher encompassing management in relation to humans. And this something can overturn all previous notions of possible scenarios for the development of events. What I told you how Pushkin spoke about this, let's refer again to his verbal formula. What did he say? Conduct is not algebra. The human mind, in common parlance, is not a prophet, but a guesser. It sees the general course of things. Yes, one can see the general course of things, the statistics, everything we have considered. But what does Pushkin's verbal formula conclude with? And he says, but he is not given the opportunity to foresee the case of a powerful, instantaneous instrument of conduct. Why? Because in relation to man, to human society, God is the highest hierarchical authority, and when necessary, he intervenes in these processes. And this is not subject to control. To be specific, let's talk about historical events. Lenin was destroyed, I told you, by the hope of Konstantin Krupskaya. And whose plans was it supposed to continue according to the plans of the global backstage? Leba Davidovich Bronstein by the cunning hook, right? But what next? It is impossible to foresee the case of a powerful, instantaneous instrument of conduct. Leba falls seriously ill and cannot govern Russia, although he was supposed to replace Lenin. He was an outstanding, fiery revolutionary, and according to the plans of the global backstage, he was supposed to continue the permanent revolution. He is its author. But then it happened, Leba fell ill, and Stalin took over the management of the country. Here you have, so to speak, a powerful, instantaneous instrument of conduct. What goes beyond the comprehensible? That is, generally speaking, here is a little picture drawn on this diagram. But this intervention, one must understand further, as I illustrated, is an intervention from above. Something happening is not without reason. It is always conceptually consistent. And the intervention of God, figuratively speaking, operates in full management function. That is, God has a design, yes, in relation to us, and if he indeed sees that help is needed, he provides that help to those whose activities align with his divine providence, although these people may not even suspect it. Because God is merciful, compassionate, and he does not wish evil to anyone. God is love. But this intervention of God lies within the bounds of probability, you see, in the barely realizable, in the variance of the future. That is, this divine providence or the randomness of events cannot foresee the occurrence of chance. This is precisely where the probability of an event's realization is low, right here. Why? Because God has endowed us with great freedom of will, that is, choice. That is, we are generally, I say, smart people, right? That is, we can think independently. That is, God does not control wives, you know, like puppets, those who portray themselves in dances. No. He says, people, you decide for yourselves. At the right moment, I will help you. That is, God has endowed man with great freedom of will. This also needs to be understood as divine providence. And then again, the thesis is that personnel decide everything. There are people under whose management any undertaking perishes. That is, just put him in charge, right? That is, these are managers of ruin. And there are people under whose management the impossible is accomplished. In this sense, Stalin's phrase, the formula, personnel decide everything, that is, people manage specific people. And there are people who can distinguish one from another, who can manage and who cannot manage. In this sense, as they said in the army, personnel decide everything. The HR specialists who write the evaluations. I remember when they wrote my first evaluation, I was an officer, a young lieutenant. I had a group commander, Major Kozlov, and he said, well, what should I write? I said, just write what you want, that I'm young. And he snorted and said, you're wrong, Petrov, to say that. I can write you a good evaluation, but at the bottom, I can smear a little bit of crap, and that crap will stink for your whole life. What can I say? We judged people based on evaluations. They write it down, and then they label you. And that's how it is for your whole life, so to speak. And it is believed that a person cannot change, but a person can change throughout life, right? So these personnel officers, the managers who determine and allocate personnel, they do not consider that rational societies, by the way, already existed in primitive societies. How did the so-called savages determine things? So their leaders, shamans, and others were observant, and they distinguished among people at a young age, among children, those who were capable of leadership, because the psychological makeup, when we considered everything related to genetics, you remember, we said that a person's psychological makeup forms by the age of 10 to 12, and after that, little can be changed. Therefore, they appointed boys Based on their developmental potential, their souls at the ages of 7 to 14, there is a book by Tyler called Primitive Culture, published in 1989, which discusses this. That is, the savages approach the assessment of personnel more purposefully than we do. And now, in a mass elitist society, what is of interest, not the potential of a person, how to manage and so on, but to which clan he belongs, that is, us versus them. That is, they are placed not based on a person's merits, but based on clan affiliation, right? That is, if you are from the Yeltsin family, then I will appoint you, but if you are not from this clan, I will not appoint you. We all watch these movies together and see them. But what does society need? Society needs to know how. It will be managed, and it doesn't matter who, but how. By what rules and by what concept public processes will be managed.